Welcome back. We're talking about a domestic US law and others that gives American officials international jurisdiction. Still with me is Chandran Nair, founder and CEO of the Global Institute for Tomorrow. In London, Jacob Parakilas works on the US project for Chatham House. From Nairobi.Macharia Munene is a professor of history and international relations at the United States International University. And with me here in the studio is Paul Schiff, Berman, professor of law at the George Washington University. Jacob, I want to go to you in London for this second half. Do you see problems here with US jurisdiction going forward, considering they're acting unilaterally, will encourage other countries to do the same? For example, we saw with Spain, for example, going after General Pinochet from Chile unsuccessfully, but it creates all this sort of legal mess going forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a sense of sort of perverse incentives, both in terms of how U.S. bureaucracies act and how broader international systems respond to the precedents that the U.S. sets. It's much easier to expand power, to create new authorities for military or law enforcement or sort of international mechanism enforcement than it is to roll them back. And I think we've seen that very strongly in the post-9/11 Patriot Act world, where it was very, very easy for Congress to pass a sweeping law because they all wanted to be seen as responding aggressively to the challenge posed by international terrorism. But at the same time, no one wants to be the person who says, we don't need this anymore. We don't need the ability to go after something because, you know, if then it can be placed on you, the failure of the government to prevent an attack, then it becomes much more difficult to sort of survive politically and to maintain a legacy. So, I mean, I think that sense of perverse incentive is also going to apply internationally, where other states are going to look at the United States and its actions and say, this is, you know, the U.S. has done this, they don't have grounds for criticizing us, and ultimately, and paradoxically, the U.S. is going to find its own actions constrained by the fact that it has set these precedents without thinking about the long term.
Paul Schiff, Berman, you want to pick up on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to recognize that this messy world that we're discussing with these multiple jurisdictional assertions, they obviously have some negative consequences. They also have some positive consequences, which is that a voice that is not heard in one place can potentially therefore be heard in another place. And sometimes that actually benefits the less powerful actors. So you could have people who can't be heard by their own government, who can access international human rights tribunals or UNESCO courts or other jurisdictions to get their voices heard.
What about a Somalian citizen who's been fighting or was recruited by Shabab, not targeting US interests, and then suddenly finds himself, Chandra said earlier, in a Brooklyn courtroom, not even knowing why they're there? I mean,
well, you know, it depends on what they did, right? So if you do something that creates an impact beyond your borders, it should not be so surprising that somebody beyond those borders might care about that.
But even if you're not targeting America, American citizens, American interests? Because that's happening.
Well, I mean, that's the question, right? Are you, in fact, doing something that targets or uses the United States? So, for instance, you know, FIFA has been a lot in the news where people have been prosecuted or in danger now of being prosecuted because of various kinds of corruption. You know, does that touch the United States? Well, lots of the alleged conspiratorial activity happened in the United States. It all went through American banks and so forth. So, you know, that's the
But there was a
connection.
big question.
There's always got to be some connection.
But there's a big question mark over FIFA. People said Americans don't even like football. What are they doing? But, you know,
it's true.
I'd like to go back to Macharia Munene in Nairobi. You know, a lot of suspects have been taken from the African continent and as you said, turn up in a Brooklyn courtroom at the Southern District of New York. Why Africa? Is it because of looser institutions, not the due process? Or is it to do with African governments allowing this to happen?
The weakness in various African countries is a factor in this. It's possible that some African countries may have allowed, like the person who was taken from Djibouti and straight to New York and then charged there without even knowing where he was going there, something like that. The weakness in the African continent is a factor in itself, and that's something to consider. What is it that can be done as a result? Depends on whether the AU wants to take up the matter as an infringement on what may be African jurisdiction and raise a question. One of the concerns that comes up, and I think should be considered, supposing some Americans do some awkward things, let's say in England, then does that give England power to arrest those Americans, even if they may be back in New York or California or some other places? So well, the same thing that the Americans are doing to the rest, can that also, the reciprocal part of it, is what comes up as a serious question.
Macharia, you make a good point. It does happen all the time, as Paul said, but sometimes it doesn't happen. I just want to bring in Chandran Nair again from Hong Kong. This is part of the reason, isn't it, that the US politically has not signed onto the International Criminal Court. They're worried about prosecutions of their own citizens and soldiers abroad. Is there a double standard here?
Well, I think anyone who thinks there isn't a double standard must be living on a different planet and think all the other nations that signed up to it don't have the same sort of concerns. But I think all the other nations understand that you have to abide by these multinational sort of approaches to try to solving this problem. But let me make a point here. I mean, we've talked essentially about you know, supposedly the terrorists and who's the bad guys, etc., and a bit about FIFA. But let us understand the U.S. is able to do this for two things. First, excessive military might, that it can go and essentially go anywhere in the world now, particularly with drones, attack a village in Pakistan. You and I will not know it unless there are sort of civilian casualties. I think it's called, what's the word for it? I forget. But, you know, collateral damage, etc. So you can go and do that. Most of us don't know about it. And frankly, Americans need to understand it's not winning any wars anywhere. In my view, it's making things a lot more dangerous in a lot more places. Now, if you look at the financial thing, the Americans are using essentially the exorbitant privilege, which is essentially a license that was part of the Bretton Woods agreement to be the reserve currency shared with the rest of the world. We share that license. The Americans are now using that exorbitant privilege as an instrument of foreign policy to punish those who it doesn't like, it doesn't agree with, be it the people in FIFA, and I think FIFA is a mess, needs to be sorted out. But it's almost a petty thing for the American government to go after FIFA. The things that we should be worried about is really things like the illegality of the sanctions against countries, particularly people like Iran, etc. And you can read a lot of reports about the illegality. But the problem is, in the Western world, there's been a subservience, and this includes particularly the Europeans, to essentially following the American narrative. The rest of the world doesn't buy this anymore.
Jacob Parakilas.
So the ability of the Americans to use its financial architecture, sorry, let me finish, to use its financial architecture, which it dominates, to bully the rest of the world, it's not in its interest. The more it uses it as a political instrument for foreign policy and geopolitics, the greater the risk that the dollar will become less relevant as a means of global transactions.
Jacob Parakilas, you're in Europe, well, London. Are the Europeans American poodles when it comes to this sort of jurisdiction?
No. I mean, it's much more complicated. I'm not going to deny that a lot of countries and a lot of people all over the world have anti-American feelings, and a lot of those anti-American feelings are, you know, justified by policy choices the American government has made and mistakes the American government has made. You know, I'm not going to stand here and say that the United States has been perfect or that it's been necessarily a completely fair dealer in all of its history, but no country has.
It's not anti-American, though, please. It's not anti-American. It's a view about foreign policy in the world.
Yes, but we need to not conflate.
But
Paul, come in here.
You know, I don't want to. I'm not here to defend the United States in any respect, but I think we need to not conflate acts of war, economic sanctions, and the assertion of criminal jurisdiction and the assertion of civil jurisdiction in tort cases. Those are four totally different legal regimes. And so just to lump them all together and say this is like that, I think does not help the conversation.
Excellent conversation. I just want to thank everyone. That's all we have time for. Chandran Nair in Hong Kong, thank you so much. Jacob Parakilas out of London. Macharia Munene from Nairobi, thank you as well. And of course, Paul Schiff Berman here in the studio. That's all we have time for, but the conversation does continue online. We want to hear from you. Send us your questions and comments and story ideas to theheat@cctv-america.com. You can also chat with us on Twitter. We're at cctv_America. I'm Nathan King in Washington, D.C., and thanks for being with us.